Story 1. I hit someone whilst driving at night. It wasn't human. I had always loved driving at night. When I'd first learnt to drive, I would steal my old man's car and go roaring down the rural back roads early in the morning. It gave me a sense of freedom. I had meant to set off at 8, but instead, I didn't start my long drive back until gone 10. I'd been out of town for a week, meeting some old friends and reliving the past. It was a 7-hour drive down, but that was during the day. Without any traffic, the drive should cut down to around 5 hours, tops. That was another reason I loved driving at night. I was a nervous driver when I was on the open freeway. In those moments, my safety depended on the competence of others, and I just had no faith in the competence of others. That night I had barely met 2 cars before I had to pull over, the fuel gauge dancing worryingly close to E. I turned into a shitty little gas station that was still a few miles out from the edge of town. Some teenagers were working the till. He had school books splayed out on the counter, and he was barely awake. He jumped when I walked in. I bought a packet of apple-flavored gum and put $30 on the tank. I walked out of the artificially lit convenience store and to the darkness surrounding my car. I drove a 1971 Plymouth Barracuda. She was my pride and joy. As I gently filled her up, I subconsciously rested my eyes. I jolted back to lucidity just before I fully fell asleep. I realized I had overshot it and went back into the store to pay. The kid was gone, probably on a toilet break, judging from the cans of Red Bull piled around his textbooks, so I left $10 by the register and called it a day. I got back in my car and got ready for the final stretch of the journey. Around 15 minutes later, I passed another car. It was a white sedan, fresh out of the 1980s. It was the type of car I would have whistled at if it drove by me in the street. On either side of the road was a thick forest, as impenetrable as the darkness just outside of the range of my headlights. I was used to a lack of sleep, but this was starting to get to me. I was chewing gum and listening to the radio. All it picked out was static, but that was better than silence. I had half a thermos of coffee resting on the back seat. I was planning on saving it for later on in the journey, but I had almost forgotten about it. As my eyelids became heavier, I took one hand off the wheel and tried to reach for the flask behind me. Still focusing on the road, I groped for it, but to no avail. My hand brushed past the cold metal, but I couldn't quite seem to grasp it. I exhaled and turned around. I saw the damn thing resting in between the 2 back seats. I reached over a little and grabbed it, and that's when it happened. I saw something streak across my windshield out of my peripheral vision. A great weight struck the car as I span around and stamped my foot on the brake so hard I thought the pedal would buckle under the force. My car came to a screeching halt. I sat there for a minute, my hands holding onto the wheel so hard my knuckles were turning white, and I tried to get my breathing under control. I thought about driving on and not looking back, happy to think I had just hit an unfortunate deer and left it at that. I had hit a deer, back in '98. This place was crawling with them, and they seemed almost suicidal, the amount of them that jump in front of cars this time of year. But I decided against that, and, racked with anxiety, I got out of my car. Laying on the cold gravel of the road was a body, a human body. I stared in horror as I realized what I had done. His legs were a crumpled mess, his right arm was bent at an impossible angle, and his head— oh God! His head bore the brunt of the force. It was bisected down the middle. His face was gone, unrecognizable, and clumps of grey matter oozed out from between 2 shards of his skull. The old, black frock jacket he had been wearing was now filled with his blood. My front headlight had shattered. I felt a twinge of guilt checking what damage was done to my car. It should have been the least of my worries, I know. As bad as it is to say, I was planning on leaving the body right there. driving home and forgetting about the night with the help of my good friend Jack Daniels. But then I heard the low rumble of a motor. A car was coming. I was in fight or flight mode, and I did the first thing that made sense at the time. I had an old blanket in the trunk, laid out for my dog when we went to the beach. It stunk of wet dog, but somehow I didn't think the body would mind. I rolled it out in the road and pushed the new corpse onto it as the headlights of the oncoming car neared. The contents of his head were spilling out everywhere, so I grabbed a plastic target bag and wrapped it around his head, keeping everything in one place. I lifted the body and, to my surprise, he was unusually light. It felt like lifting a small child. I cursed myself for falling in love with a car with such little space in the trunk as I crammed the body inside, closing it just as I was illuminated by a station wagon's headlights. To my horror, it did not keep going. It came to a halt next to me, and the driver started to roll down his window. Instead of accusing me of murder, the tired-looking driver asked me for directions. I saw his wife sitting in the passenger seat. His 3 kids were in the back. All of them were asleep. The man asked me for directions to the nearest motel. The nearest one I could think of was a cheap shithole called Sir Sleep-a-Lot. I had stayed there when my marriage was on the rocks, just before the divorce. I told him he had missed the turn for it, and he had to turn around, drive for 1.5 miles, take a left, then keep driving for another 2 miles. He smiled wearily and thanked me. He started to wind his window back up when he stopped. I was turning back to my car when he asked me if I had broken down and needed any help. I assured him I was fine. He thanked me again and took off into the night. I got back into the driver's seat and just sat there for a while, thinking about what I should do. I must have spent almost an hour, shivering in my seat, weighing my options. I've listened to enough true crime podcasts to know how to hide a body, but I didn't think I could stomach dismembering him. But I knew what I had to do. I started my car up and began the last leg of my journey. I passed the moss-covered sign welcoming me back to my hometown. I drove through the empty streets, each house occupied by a sleeping family. I pulled into my street, just on the edge of the suburbs. I realized, for the first time, that my hands were shaking. I tried to get it under control as I parked in my driveway and got out, stretching my weary legs. I made my way to the trunk and opened it. I half hoped the body wouldn't be there, and that this had all been some fever dream I had at the wheel. But, of course, it was still there, stained in blood and crumpled into the fetal position. Still wrapped in my dog's blanket, and with a plastic bag bearing the Target logo keeping his head in one place. I leaned in to lift him out. As I did, a voice behind me said, with little emotion, "Hello." I whipped around. Standing by his car on the other side of the fence was my neighbor, a religious but sweet guy called Gary. I always saw him as my very own Ned Flanders. I slammed my trunk shut and nonchalantly leaned against it. I greeted him, and we both just stood there awkwardly for what felt like a lifetime. Eventually, Gary said, "Well, see you later," before turning and getting in his car. I stood where I was and watched him drive off until he was out of sight. I wondered what he could be doing at 4:30 in the morning, but it felt weird of me to be suspicious of someone when I was about to bury the body of a man I had just killed. I made sure there were no other nocturnal neighbors around, and I opened my trunk once again. I picked up the strangely light corpse and nudged the trunk shut with my elbow. I hastily walked over to my front door and set the body down, fumbling with my keys. I opened the door and dragged him inside. I pulled him across the carpet, wincing at the mess I had to clean up, and to the basement door. I opened it and gently brought him down the rotting wooden steps. There was a patch of dirt in the corner of my basement where an old washing machine had been. I kept meaning to cement it over, but, thankfully, never got around to it. I lay the body down next to the dirt patch. I rolled him out of the blanket and got a good look at him for the first time, Not that I particularly wanted to. I bunched up the blood-stained blanket and set it down on a workbench I never used. My sister had been looking after my dog Lassie while I was away. I was supposed to pick her up tomorrow, but I didn't fancy the idea of digging up the remains. Since I didn't have a shed, I kept a shovel in the same little room under the stairs where I kept the boiler. As I walked back up the basement stairs, I realized my shake was back. The brevity of what I was about to do was taking hold. I made a B-turn to the kitchen and fumbled with the lock on my liquor cabinet. I took out a half-empty bottle of 90 proof and slumped into an old oak chair, the sole inheritance from my grandfather. Once it was finished, I began to reason with myself. I thought the man I killed might have been the person who was responsible for the recent spate of disappearances. A serial killer who was stalking the back roads late at night, who fell victim to a weary driver. If this was true, then what I had done was a net positive to the world, so I clung to that thought. That's when I heard a noise. It was the type of noise you'd hear as you were drifting off to sleep. The type of noise that'd tear you back into lucidity. I heard it again. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. I put the bottle down and made my way out of the kitchen. I stood in front of the basement door, waiting to see if I could hear it again. I must have stood there for a minute or two in perfect silence. I took a deep breath and grabbed the shovel from the cramped storeroom. Either way, it was time for me to do what needed to be done. With a heavy heart, I opened the door. Standing amongst the shadows at the foot of the stairs was the body. I realized, to my horror, that the noise I heard was the thing's bones snapping back into place. It stood there, staring up at me. It still had the plastic bag over its head, but I could tell it was staring directly into my eyes. I let out a whimper and took a step back. The body let out a shrill scream as its feet left the ground. It floated there for a second as I was frozen from shock. The body jerked and came hurtling up the stairs. I was snapped out of my trance and acted quickly enough to slam the door shut. The force that hit it from the other side shook the hinges. I gritted my teeth, desperately trying to hold the door shut as the body pounded it and snarled from the other side. I looked down at the shovel by my side. I took a hand away from the door to grab it, and as soon as I did I felt the weight hit me. I almost let it loose from the basement. I grabbed the shovel and wedged it in between the door and the wall behind me. I mustered up enough courage to let go of the door and winced. Thankfully, the shovel was enough to keep it in place. I hopped over the spade, ran past the blood-stained carpet and, stupidly, ran past the front door. Instead, I went upstairs to my bedroom. I staggered to my closet and dropped to my knees. I took out the Webley revolver my father gave me when I first moved out. I kept it, along with some loose ammunition wrapped in a piece of tin foil, in a shoebox. I hastily loaded it and got to my feet. I held it like I had seen in the detective films. All I know about guns is they shoot. I never learned how to use them properly, never thought I needed to. I made my way down the landing and crouched when I got to the stairs. I warily took 3 steps down to get a view of the basement's entrance. The door was wide open. The shovel had been snapped in half. I raised my gun and pointed at the shadows in the area where I thought the body might be. It felt weird calling it a body, but I didn't know what else to say. I kept my gun level, but heard a noise slowly getting louder. It sounded like a flock of birds landing on the roof. I looked around for its source and saw it. The body was crawling upside down on the ceiling. It had just crawled out of the doorway from the dining room into the living room and was coming straight for me. I stumbled backwards and ran back into my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I hid under my bed and held my breath. I heard the body take dull, methodical steps until it stopped directly outside of my door. I fought the urge to scream. From my little hiding spot, I saw my bedroom door slowly creaking open, and the body walked in. All I could see of it was its feet, which were clubbed and malformed like a polio victim. Its skin was bone-white and dotted with dark purple pustules. Each step looked more painful than the last as it walked around my room. Its breathing was labored and muffled slightly by the plastic bag that it still hadn't taken from its face. I didn't move a muscle. I was paralyzed with fear. I don't think I even breathed. I watched it hobble around my bedroom until it was satisfied I was nowhere to be found. It slowly turned around and walked back out. I stayed where I was for a few minutes, trying desperately to think of what to do next. I calmed myself, got my shaking under control, and rolled out from under the bed. The body was floating in the middle of my room, a meter or so off the ground. It was hunched over where it met the ceiling and looked directly at me. It dived towards me, and I fired blindly. I was inexperienced with using a gun, but I was so close to it, it was almost impossible to miss. All 5 shots hit their target. The body faltered in the air and slammed into my bedside cabinet. I got to my feet and scrambled to my door. I looked back to see the body convulsing. I ran in abject terror and made my way down the stairs in a controlled fall. I hadn't even reached the ground floor before the body came hurtling out of my room, flying through the air as if something had thrown it. I grabbed my keys from the little ceramic bowl by the front door and fumbled with them until I found the right one. I burst out of my house and ran frantically down the driveway to my car. I opened the door and fell into the driver's seat. When I looked up, I saw the body standing in the doorway of my house. It slowly reached for its face and ripped the plastic shopping bag off. I wish it hadn't. The body flung itself at the car, just as I got the engine going. It latched onto the hood and let out a guttural cry as it started to violently head but the windscreen. I pulled into the street and drove blindly into the night. Cracks appeared on the glass, and I feared it would shatter. Its forehead was bleeding now, but it didn't seem to care. It was then I got a good look at its face. Its skin was a tallow white, with the mottled texture of chronic rheumatism. Its eyes were pure black, bulging from its head as if they were to fall out and leaking vile pus from the edges. Its nose and ears looked like they had been gnarled off by a rabid dog, leaving only scared, shapeless stumps. The thing's gums were necrotic. Its teeth were shattered and ripping through exposed nerves. All but the front canines, which seemed dagger-like and immaculate. I hit the brakes. The body flew from the hood and skidded across the tarmac road, degloving any exposed skin as it slid, leaving a trail of blood behind it. I revved my car before driving over the body for the second time that night. I stopped and collected myself. I took a deep breath in and another out. I held the steering wheel tightly and focused my mind. As I was calming myself, I saw something move from out of the corner of my eye. I looked in the wing mirror to see the body slowly rise to its feet. I turned around in my seat and stared slack-jawed at it. It looked back at me before dropping to all fours. I watched as it scurried down the street to my house. It looked back at me one more time as it stood up and calmly walked into my home, the front door slamming shut behind it. At this point, a few neighbors had woken up. From the sirens in the distance, I knew at least one had phoned 911. I drove to the outskirts of town, parked up the bridge, and slept for the first time in what felt like a week. I woke up to a teenager banging on my door, laughing as I jolted awake and running off to continue his walk to school. On a tank of fumes, I made my way to my sister's. I write to you now from her guest room, my dog Lassie curled up at my feet. I planned on going back to my house. My sister had convinced me that most of what happened that night was just a weird experience with a crackhead. It wasn't until writing this all down did I realize how bullshit of an excuse that is. Story 2. Why I Know Valentine's Day is Cursed. 19 and pure, the last of the I Don't Care years, The end of an era, as many would say, but nobody could foresee it being the end of all relationships for young Alex and me. The year was 2017, and I was a freshman 3 months into my new adventure on Life College, not the first place I wanted to be spending the last of my teen days, but myself and Alex had each other to stay afloat friends. Since virtually birth, there was nothing that could separate us. We spent many days alone in our college dorm board looking for that next party, that next adventure. We were not the outgoing type, we were very shy in our own right, so when the day came that we got our invitations to one of the biggest parties of the year, neither one of us really knew what to make of it. However, considering the fact we were both virgins and never really got invited to anything, we took this opportunity as a sign of hope to mainly meet girls, but also to once and for all break free from the social anxiety we both suffered from since our youth years. We spent the remaining days leading up to this party deciding what to wear, what to talk about, how we were going to get girls, all of that, but deep down we were scared. We were scared of what awaited us outside of this dorm. Would it go to plan? Would it go horribly wrong? Only time could tell. Finally, the night was here like a blur. The last 3 days just rushed by like they never happened. The clock struck 8 p.m., and we knew it was time for us to say goodbye to the comfort and safety of our dorms and proceed into the world that we knew so little about. Like a bird leaving its nest for the first time, me and Alex swung our door open and proceeded to the north side of the campus where the party was happening. After a brief walk and a lot of anxiety, we finally reached the north side of the campus, where a large building now stood before us. Me and Alex both looked at each other before proceeding to the front stairs of the building, breathing heavily. We proceeded up the stairs, pushing a large door open as we entered the overcrowded room. We both just stared in amazement as there was hundreds of teens drinking and talking together. We felt so alive but also worried. The night went on normally. We were no doubt 4 hours in at this point, and have had a few drinks, as I haven't even noticed Alex was missing until I was tapped on the shoulder and led to a room by a girl who I soon figured out was having relations with Alex. The next thing I can recall was waking up in a bed nude with a girl next to me and the cops clearing the house. I looked over to wake Alex, but he was not there. It was just me and the girl. Confused, I got up to grab my clothes and stumbled into the hall, no doubt still drunk. I ran into an officer, who I then gave my description of Alex to. As I looked everywhere and could find him, the officer simply took the description from me and told me to go back to my dorm. Doing so, I believed that Alex would be there to tell me how messed up I looked and how it felt to lose the V card together. However, he was not there, and his stuff was gone, as if he was never there to begin with. I must have passed out, as the next time I woke up it was morning. Hungover and still dizzy, I left the room to go to our administrative building. However, when I reported Alex missing, I was told there was no student with that first or last name enrolled at this school. Now more confused than I already was, I asked her, "Then what happened to my room, mate? Why do I remember Alex if you say there is no such student?" She looked at me for a moment before proceeding to tell me that I was alone and that there was no roommate assigned to my dorm. It was safe to say at this point that I lost my mind with her. I walked away cursing as I left the building, finally falling to my knees and crying. I looked at my phone to get his number to call him to tell him that this prank wasn't funny and that it has gone too far, but his number, it wasn't there. June 20th, 2021 was the day I said goodbye to that campus. However, I never gave up on finding Alex until June 21st, that is. On June 21st, 2021, I was cleaning out my locker after being given 1 extra day to clean our stuff out, when I found it a note that said, "Look in the library," signed February 14th, 17. It was from the day he vanished. It was his handwriting, all right, and his initials. Excitement filled me as I rushed to the library, thinking if this was some joke. I got so many questions, and then I might even punch him, that jerk, I thought to myself. However, when getting to the library, I did not find Alex as I hoped. Instead, I found a yearbook sitting on the far back table, marked February 14th, 1999. Confused, I opened it to the bookmarked page, and in red marker a photo was circled, Alex Forster. A cold breeze ran down my back, and the pages flipped to the back of the book. A message in red, it said, "Use me." There laid a flash drive. Without thinking, I popped it into the desktop and read the article it linked to. On February 14th, 1999, police were called to the north campus of the local community college, where a boy later revealed as 19-year-old Alex Forster, a freshman that was new to the campus, was hanging from the Alpha Beta's frat house upper deck. Police report seeing claw marks across the teen's chest and legs, indicating a struggle with some kind of animal. Police inquire locals about leads into the murder of the freshman, but nobody came forward and no arrests have been made was ever arrested. It still remains one of the town's biggest cold cases. If you have any information, you are to call the local PD. I could not believe what I was reading. A tear formed down my face as I read it. What I was reading just couldn't be true. My best friend, my only friend, was never real.
No.
I refused to believe it. I was later removed from campus by security, as I tore the library apart in what my doctors now explain was a mental breakdown. They tell me I made all of it up, but I still remember him to this day, and I refuse to forget him. 4 teens have gone missing from there every year since I found the truth. I wonder if it's cursed, as each disappearance has happened on Valentine's Day. I really may never know the truth, but I'm never going to stop looking either.